The Alpha Horizon. Thinking different, acting aware.
Welcome to this edition of the Algebris Alpha Horizon podcast. My name is Douglas Branson and I'm Head of Business Development at Algebris. I'm pleased to be joined today by Simon Peters, who is our investment strategist. So the purpose of today's podcast is to discuss the opportunity in financial equities. And there tend to be two primary points that help highlight when there is an investment opportunity. One of those is when the fund manager thinks it exists. And then secondly is when clients ask about it. And at the moment, we are getting quite a few queries, regular questions about the opportunity in financial equities. And as we continue to receive this interest, we felt that it would be helpful and a good idea to discuss the environment and the opportunity. Welcome, Simon. Thanks very much for joining me. So I'll start with question one. Since the vaccine rollout started, inflation expectations and long bond yields have been rallying globally. US fiscal stimulus is accelerating this trend, and the EU Recovery Fund stimulus will kick in later this year as well. How is this impacting the market and the financial sector specifically?
Hi, Doug. That's a good question because it points to the huge inflection that we're seeing in the market. The greatest GDP drawdown in 100 years last year was met with an enormous QE buy program and rate cuts, or peak monetary stimulus, if you like. In the cautious environment that prevailed, this led to all-time low yields and very tight spreads in Q3. However, economies quickly rebounded and vaccines began to be successfully rolled out, which caused equity markets to hit peak levels. Further, unprecedented levels of fiscal support are also just kicking in as optimism returns. All this has led the markets to increase both inflation expectations and long bond yields from their lows. Now, the biggest beneficiary of those changes are the banks, which is the most positively geared sector to these trends. But the insurance sector is actually the second biggest beneficiary, so overall, it really is the financial sector that wins. We've seen a bounce in US and European banks, but the banks in Europe, for example, are still only sitting slightly above where they bottomed in March 2009, just as the new economic cycle is starting.
Just before I ask question two, a lot of clients are making the point that when they're recognizing that there is an interest in financial equities, they're accompanying that interest with questions around what's different and what's actually changed this time for the banks. How have the banks coped with the COVID storm?
The big difference, and it is clear to me, that the market is going to conclude sometime this year, is that the banks are finally fit for purpose, which should benefit both equity and credit investors. And I don't think that was a foregone conclusion coming into the COVID recession. European banks have spent more than a decade tripling their capital ratios and reducing bad debts and other risks. Now, not one bank last year needed to raise capital, and capital ratios were higher by the end of the year than at the start. Large provisions were taken in the first half, but by Q3, profits and capital were building again. And even the regulators, the Fed, Bank of England and the ECB, have switched capital distributions back on again since December. So the banks have been very resilient in this recession and have finally proved themselves.
Thanks. Okay, it seems that some or possibly many investors' portfolios are not really positioned to benefit if the vaccine rollout continues to be such a success, despite the odd hiccup, obviously, and we then see the resultant economic bounce in half two. So how could investors adjust for this?
You're right. We've had a lot of interest and questions from clients since December as investors search for alternatives to some of their no or barely positive return fixed income investments or their equity investments that are close to all-time highs. For example, the S&P is currently only yielding 1.6%, for example. Well, the financial sector is the most positively geared sector into the recovery as rates and inflation expectations climb. And it is perhaps interesting to note that not only is the sector the prime beneficiary of current trends, but with AT1s in credit having wider spreads now than pre-COVID and the European Bank Equity Index trading only slightly higher than the global financial crisis lows of March 2009, we have a compelling set of reasons to buy into the financial sector now.
Great, thank you. And then leading on to question four, what are the prospects for investors in the financial sector for the rest of this year and into 2022? And, what's the investment horizon for the current opportunity in financial equities?
Well, we are particularly focused on European banks, US life insurance, and various idiosyncratic ideas in US banks and asset managers. European banks have more than 50% upside to where they were a few years ago, and they're sitting on their highest levels of capital ever, 7% dividend yields, and they're going to benefit from this upcoming economic cycle. US life insurers that we hold are likely to return in dividends and buybacks around 25% of their market cap in the next 2 years. And regarding the investment horizon, what has really changed is that the banks are finally, and after more than a decade, fit for purpose. And so they move from being a trade to an investment, with the banks the cheapest they've been for 20 years by some metrics and likely to benefit from the trends in this new economic cycle. They're likely to perform well for the next 3 to 5 years.
So that just leaves me to thank Simon and, of course, our listeners. The purpose of this edition of the Alpha Horizon was to respond to the interest that we're seeing in financial equities from clients and to highlight the opportunity. Please keep an eye out for more editions of this podcast, and we will continue to add new episodes and to respond to investors' interests and questions and do what we can to highlight opportunities in our specialisms of global financials and global credit markets. So thank you again for listening, and until next time.
The Alpha Horizon. Thinking different, acting aware.